So I feel really tall up here. I'm gonna get on the floor. It's getting so ridiculous. I fall off. Yeah, it's a little very good. Thanks everyone for taking time on a Tuesday night to come out. We're really excited that the Kangaroo Wildlife Network is able to sponsor events like this. So Science Near the Scrub, what a clever little name. It was going to be Science in the Pub, but then we moved to the Scrub. And yeah, we've got some really exciting speakers tonight, so I will hopefully pronounce everything correctly. But we have, first of all, I want to thank the American River Town Hall Committee for having us tonight and hosting this event. That's been really brilliant space to use. And so tonight we've got Maddie Katz and Dr. Dom, because I can't say his last name.
Yep.
Properly. And Maddie's going to talk to us first tonight, and
not anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the computer changed our minds.
Okay. Dr. Dom is one of South Australia's leading marine ecologists from the University of Adelaide. And Dom's research has focused on restoring lost shellfish reefs, and he's played a key role in pioneering community-driven marine restoration projects across the state, which is great. You've done all those things?
Yeah, that's true. Some truth in it. Yeah.
And Maddie Katz is the owner of the Wildlife Dive Shot and director of Air Lab, an organization dedicated to education and community engagement in restoration ecology. Maddie's been at the forefront of connecting regional tourism with marine conservation, from the giant cuttlefish in Whyalla to oyster reef restoration in Coffin Bay. And it's very exciting to have people like this in our lives because they can empower our communities to get involved with our natural world. So we're really excited about some collaborations in the future, and however that evolves will be really exciting. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dom first to the stage and Manny after that.
Thanks everyone for having us, and thanks for your patience as well. I had just finished putting together a stellar performance and my computer crashed. So I've had to dig up something else, and we'll see what's in there. I'll be as surprised as you are. But I'm very comfortable talking about this image. This is O'Sutherland's, this is the shellfish reef restoration off O'Sutherland's beach. 22 reefs constructed in 2022, over 5 hectares, and that's me arriving to work there on our dive boat. This is just one of approximately 30 large reef restorations across Australia, but there are many reef restorations that have been undertaken over the last 10 years in particular. And I can reflect a little bit on my journey. Back in 2012, I was looking for an honours project to do. I didn't want to get a job, so I thought I'll just do another year of honours, and I wanted to study ants for some reason. And I came across a paper that had just been published at the time describing the historical loss of oyster reefs around the world, and this number that we had lost 85% of reefs, and in Australia over 99% of reefs. Our reefs are considered functionally extinct, which didn't make any sense to me because, growing up on the east coast of Australia, you see oysters everywhere. They're attached to pylons and rocky shorelines and any hard substrate. In the intertidal, you'll see the Sydney rock oyster. So it didn't make much sense, but I started to dive a bit deeper and discovered this wonderful world of oyster culture, how oysters have, how humans have interacted with oysters over a long time, and I was going to show you some slides about that. But I can just tell you instead that humans have been interacting with oysters and their bivalve cousins for millions of years. Multiple human species of multiple continents over the last 500,000 years have used oysters for different reasons. We had Homo erectus using oyster shells and mussel shells to scribe art. Half a million years ago, some of the first known artistic depictions or artistic expressions by any human species being carved on the inside of these shells in Indonesia. We had Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalis, diving for oysters and cockles to make jewellery over the last few hundred years. And of course, contemporary modern Homo sapiens have been using oysters since day dot. And that's a long relationship which has turned quite sour over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution and the really efficient means by which we've been able to scrape oysters from the sea floor. So that's why we've lost oyster reefs over such gargantuan scales that are hard to even imagine. Yeah, why don't we go to the next slide, see what it is. So this is one of the reasons why we're now restoring oysters, because of the many different ecological benefits that they provide. So oyster reefs, everybody knows about oysters. Whenever I start talking about oysters and talking about their restoration, people ask when we can eat them. We're not restoring these ones to eat, they're going down so they can provide the ecosystem benefits and services that they provide. And there's 4 main services that we try to repair when we're restoring oyster reefs. And in South Australia, a big motivator has been the fish productivity benefits of restored reefs, because they are natural fish factories of the sea. Where you have more oysters, you often have more fish. And that was how the community across South Australia, in particular on the Metro Coast and over on near Ardrossan, where the first reefs were built, that's how it was described. But they also provide physical living structures that can dampen wave energy. The physical structures they provide as oysters come together form these complex 3-dimensional habitats, which might seem quite small and insignificant, but to invertebrates, it's a metropolis of habitat, and you get these incredibly dense communities of bivalves living of all sorts of different invertebrates that live in amongst the oysters, and they feed the fish in the higher trophic levels and so forth. And they're also the tridivores, the grazers, the things that enable marine ecosystems to turn over nutrients and other things. And then the other main thing that they do, which takes on new significance given the current climate we're living in and the devastating harmful algal bloom, is the potential to filter water. And they're really good at that. Why don't we go to the next slide, see what it is. Okay, well, the context for all the restoration work that we had been doing over the past decade has changed over the last 6 months dramatically. And now we're looking and talking about reef restoration from a different perspective. Same goal, but the services that we're really interested in now is reintroducing this filtration capacity. So I'll just say that this is the narrative that's emerged through conversations among scientists and the public, and I sit on the Harmful Algal Bloom Advisory Board, and this is something that we sort of agreed with this timeline. But over time, our certainty about different drivers of this harmful algal bloom has changed. What we are certain about is that this marine heat wave that started in September and persisted in deeper waters right through till May, it was definitely the main driver, combined with a really prolonged summer and calm conditions, which allowed coastal waters to stratify, providing these perfect conditions for the bloom to really flourish. So certainly algal blooms need nutrients, but we can't conclusively say it was contributed by the Murray floods, which you've probably heard about, or the cold water upwellings that happen every year. We had algal blooms, relatively modest ones in most cases, but right across the South Australian coast, not just this Karenia Miki Moitoi harmful algal bloom, we had them in other places. And that's, each summer we have this increase in chlorophyll A concentrations, which we can detect from satellite, and that's the data that's been used to inform the movement of the bloom, but it's far from perfect because it can't distinguish the different algal species that are actually creating that increased concentration. But just to say that this has completely turned my life upside down. Like many of you, I'm sure you're grappling with the challenges that this harmful algal bloom has created. And we have to put our hands up and say there's far more that we don't know than what we do know. And we don't know when it's going to dissipate or whether it will come back. Karenia micimoitoi does not create cysts that we know of, so lots of algal blooms, harmful blooms, they create cysts which can persist in the sediment and then come back in future years. Karenia does not do that. And there have been blooms in places that have been far larger than this, which are worthy of studying and understanding. There was one off a completely undisturbed, seemingly virgin coastline off the coast of Siberia 2 or 3 years ago, which was 30,000 square kilometres, making our one look very small, but had similar mortality effects on similar groups. And that's never come back. So that's a huge bloom, really dense concentrations, and it hasn't returned. In other parts of the world, they have different blooms which are more or less occur every few years. And people who have grown up with those blooms, it's become normalised. And I've got a student, for example, who's from Florida, and she's wondering what all the fuss is about because it's been part of her life as she's grown up. You look at the foam, you look at the conditions, and you decide whether or not to go to the beach. But this is not something we want to see normalised. So we know that climate change was driving this event through a marine heat wave, and those are anticipated to become more and more common, unfortunately. But when I was thinking about the drivers, there's another elephant in the room that people weren't really talking about at first. Manny, would you mind? And that's this catastrophic loss of oyster reefs across South Australia. So 1,500 kilometres of coastline formerly characterised by oyster reef ecosystems, which covered thousands of square kilometres of sea floor in this sort of dense oyster habitat. This is an image from Georges Bay in Tasmania, the only flat oyster reef ecosystem that was not destroyed by 19th century dredging. It's about 2 hectares in size. It's quite small. It's commercially harvested on a relatively sustainable scale. People don't really have too much of an appetite for Angassi anymore. But the scraping over decades and decades is what eventually transitioned our seafloors into these sort of shifting sands where there's no hard substrate, with the exception of maybe some razorfish, for oysters to get a foothold and start to regenerate their reefs. And that's what they need. They need that hard substrate to be able to cement themselves to something that's going to stay stable so they can start to regenerate. So this map from 1889 gives us a sense of the sort of scale over which these ecosystems existed. And certainly we know that there was oyster beds all up and down this coastline because of the oyster catch data. It wouldn't have carpeted the whole Gulf. It would have been a mosaic of razorfish, oysters, seagrass, kelp, and all sorts of different things. But the dredging of the seafloor over 100 years post-European settlement has completely transitioned those systems. And that's a sort of tragedy of the commons story that's repeated itself around the world for hundreds of years. Dredging was first invented in the 1300s, and we know that because of letters written to King Edward III requesting the banning of this new dredging technology in 1370 something. And then 200 years later, in the 1570s, dredging was banned in the Thames. That's good news. But it was already too late at that stage, and we've continued to dredge right up to the current day. So the loss of these ecosystems also has a role to play, because where we've started to restore them, we understand that they have this filtration capacity. I like to call oysters the kidneys of our coastline, or healthy oyster reefs, the kidneys of our coastline. Without those kidneys, marine ecosystems can't function. The most successful restoration we've got is at Glenelg, and that's been just in terms of oyster density and biodiversity, it's a reef I work a lot on and do fun things like play underwater music to oysters for some reason. And on those reefs, a year and a half after the reefs were constructed, I was still able to remove boulders to do filtration experiments in the lab to really identify how fast they were able to clear nutrients and algae from the water. And they were, 1 hectare of reef was clearing about 6 million litres of water a day, cleaning it, removing nutrients, removing algae, turning it from green to clear within a matter of hours. I tried to repeat that experiment over the following years and I couldn't remove any of the boulders because the oysters had physically cemented the reef together. Let's see what's next. So, you can ignore that. Some of, or those snapper swimming on newly restored reefs. So, recognition that reefs had been lost it's a relatively new knowledge. So it was late in 2011 when that global synthesis of lost oyster reefs was first published, and I came across that and thought, wow, what a story, this needs to be told. Within a few years, and then in 2015 in South Australia, the baseline of lost reefs, 1,500 kilometres, was published, and that really energised the sort of journey towards reef restoration, which, you know, there hadn't really been any reefs constructed prior to that. But in 2015, the Labor government had promised $600,000 for a recreational fishing resource. They wanted to make artificial reefs, and around about that time, that publication came out describing the loss of these reefs in South Australia, and that 600,000 then transitioned into a small restoration trial which was constructed in 2017. Really impressive and rapid how fast that came about. And then the Nature Conservancy, world's largest environmental NGO in terms of annual financial turnover, they got involved, and it turned into a 20-hectare reef, $3.6 million, which is really spare change for an infrastructure project, to construct what is still the largest reef restoration in the Southern Hemisphere, Windurra Reef. And then that gradually increased across Australia. We're seeing more restoration projects, which was very much energised when following the Black Summer fires and a 20 million investment by ScoMo at the time in bushfire recovery for coastal communities. And that line keeps going up. It's just that this paper was published back in 2022. So we have this big upswing, but then after that money in the wake of the bushfires dried up, it wasn't clear, and as you would hopefully know, there were reefs constructed just a few hundred metres from where we're standing as part of that 20 million. And also the KI Landscape Board constructed reefs, and Flinders University put some artificial structures in as well. So there's a lot of activity over a few years, but it all went quite quiet in the state. And at that time, I was working out how we could sustain this oyster restoration work. Well, I guess before we get to that, this is what was constructed. We had Windurra Reef, 159 limestone boulder reefs, huge infrastructure project. Glenelg Reef, conveniently looking like a chromosome, which is cool. O'Sutherland, the reef off O'Sutherland Beach, and then Kangaroo Island was constructed also in 2022. And some of the reefs have been quite successful. So this thing's got an ecological recovery wheel. We use this to assess the rate of recovery for restoration projects. And this, these boulders went down on the seafloor, and within 2.5 years, you had oyster densities greater than what we were seeing on those natural reefs down in Tasmania still. And flourishing biodiverse marine community. And over the past few months, I've been diving on a lot of those sites, and the native oysters, much to my delight, have persisting through this algal bloom. It's not to say that that situation won't change. The bloom is very dynamic. There's at least 12 species that have been identified. There's probably many more harmful algal species within the bloom, and some are toxic to oysters, some create brevetoxins. We haven't identified the bloom, the algal species that creates the brevetoxin, but we know it's out there. But to date, the oysters seem to be really flourishing, and flourishing even on oyster leases in Stansbury, where they've had some of the highest Karenia concentrations. The oysters are filtered. The poor farmers can't sell their oysters, but the oysters are out there filtering the stock and looking really quite healthy. So they have a level of resilience to this bloom, and that sort of caught the ear of the South Australian government in a vacuum of not a vacuum, in an atmosphere of dismay and uncertainty on what could actually be done to tackle this bloom. They've really been talking about oyster reef restoration a lot more. So to restore oyster reefs, we need to take this whole of society approach, and that terminology is now used in the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, the global standard for how we're supposed to curb this biodiversity crisis that we're living through. Biodiversity crisis is arguably more pressing than the climate crisis, because biodiversity regulates climate and can mitigate the impacts of climate change, such as large oyster reefs that, if you can restore an oyster reef and it can clear 6 million litres of water per hectare per day, if you can restore at really large scales, that can make a meaningful difference. But large-scale reefs, we've shown, can work, but also the more small-scale community-based reefs have a really important function to play. They do different things. And a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing with Manny over the next few years is sort of facilitating more of these community projects across South Australia to provide an evidence base, using research reefs, to provide an evidence base on where we should be investing in really large reef restorations going forward. So we've got this large-scale demonstration, but the small-scale reefs are also really valuable, and I do a lot of social science as well, at building community resilience and increasing human community resilience as a means of bringing people together and providing them with educational opportunities and all sorts of different, with a bit of empowerment, a bit of agency to do something about marine disasters. So as that funding dried up and not many people were working on oyster reef restorations, I was looking at ways to expand the work across the state, and that's how Manny and I came across each other. He picked up the phone one day asking what all these dead oyster shells meant on the seafloor, and then here we are a few years later. We decided to start a community-based project where we engaged local high schools. We went and spoke at a few schools around the Coffin Bay area where Manny lives. And we actually ran an internship program where we recruited 10 students through an essay process that they had to submit for them to get involved in this restoration research project. And Manny provided them with scuba diving training, so they got certified as scuba divers, and that was really awesome and enabled them to get in the work and do the hands-on stuff. And with those, in working with the students, we were able to sort of identify some of the different benefits that they were experiencing. It was really exciting to see these kids, who are interested in the marine environment and have spent their lives growing up by the sea, but can now see exciting opportunities as career paths going forward. So with the students, we put together these restoration units. We deployed them at 8 sites across 28 units deployed across 8 sites around Coffin Bay, some in sanctuary zones, some outside of sanctuary zones, to understand what the sanctuary zones do. And then we brought them in after 3 months just to try and understand where the oysters are recruiting. We use settlement panels, so you can quickly identify. I think if you press the button, it'll move through. So you can identify when and where oysters are recruiting, where it might be better to do to upscale reef restoration. And then, you know, with a bunch of honours and master's students working together with the school students and any other locals who are happy to swing by, we produced some pretty cool research, which has been really useful in taking this work to the government. So we found that, you know, there was incredibly high oyster recruitment. That's what this is on the side here. Oysters per metre squared, you know, up to sort of 20,000 oysters per metre squared settling within the baskets within the first 3 months. And that varied a heck of a lot, and we can use that information to identify key sites to do more of this work. Heaps of biodiversity associated with after just a few months. And, you know, finding species that have never been documented on the Eyre Peninsula as well, and feeding that into open access citizen science platforms like iNaturalist that have become really, really popular. And we're hearing a lot about iNaturalist in the wake of the HAB. We then socialised that data back to the community. We ran community forums like this in Coffin Bay. We've done a few of those now. And then just captured people's response to that work. And we're finding that people were very surprised and really sort of excited to see more of this work, which is what we then went ahead and did. We started upscaling the work and applying for more funding and using, I forgot this was in my pocket, but using this biodegradable mesh, which is a purpose-made product for reef restoration. Because you can fill it with coral, rubble, shells, hard substrate, and it's made out of disused wood pulp, and it will stay and hold those structures together for 4 to 5 years before it rots away. By that time, hopefully the oysters have recruited, cemented, and consolidated those structures. So it's nice we can use completely biodegradable and natural materials such as used oyster shells, which are, you know, often sometimes a burden for oyster farmers to have to get rid of. One more. And so this mesh was only developed a few years ago in the Netherlands, but it's now used all around the world. And it's a great product because quite easily you can engage people to get involved using you know, mainly off-the-shelf parts. And we work with local oyster farmers, so that's a pile of disused shell. They'd have to take that to landfill sometimes. But once that shell is sterilised and cleaned, then we can start to bag it and construct these sort of mosaics of reef, and then work out, you know, what different designs mean for different animal species that might colonise it, potentially different, if we can construct them in certain configurations, certain shapes will retain more sediment if that's of value to local communities. Some of them will help seagrass come back if that's important. And by working with industry, we're really able to upscale this work. And Manny can talk more about that. But Manny he runs the glass bottom boat tours for the cuttlefish. I won't steal his thunder, but we collaborated with the cutties to deploy larger reefs and constructed reefs at 5 sites using that first bit of data that we created. We pick some sites strategically, working with government all the time because we need to get permits for all this work. And we've just surveyed those reefs after a year, and they again are full of oysters. So it looks like it's a really efficient means of being able to sort of get your hands wet and construct a bit of habitat that can come back. So I was asked a few months ago to put together a small proposal for just a few more of these reefs, and to my great surprise, the state government got very excited about it, and it's turned into quite a large project to construct more of these community-based projects, or develop more of these community-based projects in partnership with local communities and industries, to do more of this work around the state. And that's an AI-generated image of what it might look like, but you know, we're going to look at developing some infrastructure, some trucks, some ability to come around and quickly process that shell, because otherwise it can be a lengthy process, and work with local oyster farmers to make sure that we're sort of benefiting them as well, going out on local oyster punts, and then designing with community and local government reefs that are valued by community, sort of incorporating the values and desires, and you know, we can do that by modifying reef design and location based on what people want. This map here was produced by the state government. The dark green is high confidence of where there were reefs historically. The striped low confidence, but you know, we know there were huge amounts of reef, and it's likely there was a lot of reef here. It's just there's in KI, but there's not necessarily the historical data to pinpoint precisely where it was. But we can do that by just putting out some of these bags and starting to build that knowledge base of where we might be able to restore. And there's already reefs out there. Landscape Borders have done them. KI have done. TNC have done them. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunity to learn from what's been done to date, and then to keep growing incrementally through community engagement and school engagement. And yeah, I think I'm about done. Definitely need a drink. So 2 minutes? Okay. I'm not done. Yeah, oh yeah, sure. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to fire away. More than happy. Otherwise, yes, great.
How do you clean and sterilise the old shells?
So the simplest way is to put them in the sun for 6 months. Where that's not possible, there's a few different heat treatment methods that we can use. Heating the shell for 5 minutes at 80 degrees, for example, kills pretty much every pathogen. So yeah, there's a lot of fair bit of research that's been done on that by the oyster aquaculture industry across Australia. I think you were first.
What's the difference between the filtration of an oyster versus a mussel or a scallop? Because we've lost all our scallops and mussels in the bay.
Yeah.
We don't know whether they're going to come back.
Yeah, so they all filter at slightly different rates, but they're all valuable. And when I talk about oyster reef restoration, hi girls. What I'm really talking about is shellfish reef restoration. So reefs are designed to help mussels come back, oysters. I'm really interested in razorfish and understanding how we can better bring them back. For example, you could grind up shell and use that as a chemical cue to facilitate their recruitment to certain areas. Haven't done that, that's my next experiment. Just like we use sound, the natural sounds of the sea can attract oysters and all sorts of other species. So we use underwater speakers to lure them towards the sites that we want to restore. But oysters generally have higher filtration rates because they can be larger organisms, but you know, razorfish will clear crazy amounts of water. So a large Pacific oyster could filter 200 litres of water a day. That's a huge amount of water when you consider that these reefs are made up of billions of oysters and other shellfish. So, yeah.
Just wondering, would the installation of fixed reefs inhibit the sand drift that's happening on the Adelaide coast from south to north? And how they have to continually pump and dump sand?
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? So a lot of work's been done with SA Water and Flinders and myself on the oceanography and sediment movement, and the reef at Glenelg, for example, is it's not dampening wave energy or anything like that, but it is incrementally increasing sediment retention. So it can work.
Put in those artificial groins years ago, but in the big bags.
Yeah.
They slowly disintegrated over the years.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether a natural reef out there would be better served.
Yeah, well, you know, seagrass existed right up to the shoreline not that long ago. There's still some parts in the coastline where you can see that 5,000 hectares of seagrass lost from poor water quality running off the coast there. But that seagrass can't come back because it can exist there as an intact meadow. So we can use oyster reefs to help bring back seagrass as well. And together they can help stabilise the coast. I mean, we need to look at those nature-based solutions because trucking sand down the coast is just madness. Yeah.
Are these reefs going to spread naturally? And have you got any idea how quick they're going to spread?
I don't have any idea how. Actually, I do have an idea of how quickly they might spread. Before my presentation crashed, I had an opening slide and I'll try and dig it out while Manny's having questions so I can show you of a natural reef that Manny and I came across last year in Coffin Bay. And it's an intertidal reef, so we can track its movement. It wasn't there 20 years ago and now it's like 3.5 hectares and there's been no restoration intervention there. It's just a relatively quiet area where razorfish have been able to interact with the flood oysters and they've spread across this sedimentary plain. So oysters will naturally spread beyond the footprint of the reef where the oyster reefs succeed. But how long that will take along the Metro Coast or other areas, I'm not 100% sure. But you know, we knew we were stuffing up the seafloor after about 4 decades of dredging. So dredging started in just a few years after 1836 when Adelaide was settled, and after about 3.5, 4 decades, an inspector of oyster fisheries was employed to try and rejuvenate those reefs, and what did work were fisheries closures. And if you stop dredging, hey presto, it comes back. And those closures often, on average, would last sort of 9 years before these beds can rejuvenate. In some places where you had oysters and razorfish overlap, they would just be closed for 3 or 4 years. So these are systems that can come back really quickly, and we've completely destroyed this habitat, but there's still enough individuals here and there that there are babies out in the water looking for a place to live. So yeah, and we've shown we can bring them back relatively quickly. Well, I think it's probably a good time for Manny to come on out and dazzle you. So thanks for listening, and I'll be around at the end. This thing? Oh yeah, I can't watch.
No, that's all good. All right. So really quick. All right, thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and thanks for the American River Community Hall for hosting. Really appreciate that, and thanks for the KI Wildlife Network for making this event possible. Really appreciate that. Thank you. And thanks to Dom for that awesome presentation. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but glad we could make it here. So today, so my name is Manny Katz, and I am here today to talk about regional South Australian marine tourism insights. I have a dive shop in Whyalla called Y-Dive, and I have a NGO that I help run, the Educating Youth in Restoration Ecology Lab. So you might need to click through it a couple times. I think it's going to be, it's one of those. You might, just keep clicking. Sorry about that. So we want to, engage with schools, with youth in restoration projects. We want to facilitate education and training opportunities, like how Dom mentioned before, and conduct research and projects aimed at conserving ecosystems. Now, a bit of context. Next slide. It's not working. So while that's, yes, okay. So if you couldn't tell by my absurd accent, yes, I'm a Yank. I'm from California. Please don't hold that against me. I'm Australian now. My wife is from their peninsula, and my kids are Australian born. Absolutely love living here. And after I graduated high school, I moved to Hawaii for a period of time, which was pretty nice. I went there to study chemistry, and that didn't last long. I dropped out after a semester. While I was there, I was volunteering at a dive shop, and I was getting a whole bunch of free experience learning how to scuba dive. And when I was at that dive shop, I started to see the negative side of tourism. I got into it because I like being in the ocean, and I loved having awesome interactions with people. That's how I met my wife, actually at that company. She was a tourist on the boat, and now here I am. But I started to see the negative impacts of tourism, particularly with interacting with different reef sites. Every action that we undertake has some sort of reaction, and oftentimes tourism operators taking large amounts of people out to coral reef ecosystems can be pretty detrimental. I would see irresponsible operators take people, and I'd see people grabbing onto corals, kicking sea turtles, really crazy stuff. And that put a really bad taste in my mouth. I thought to myself, wow, if this is what tourism is, I don't want anything to do with it. And so my first experience, it was a formative one, a bit negative, but thankfully I found a dive shop not too long after that enabled me to do some really fun and I think positive work. In particular, this one shop I worked at was partnered up with the University of Hawaii, and because we're going out to these sites every day, we could be opportunistic about collecting data. I'm a college dropout, but I still get to be a scientist of sorts, a citizen scientist. And so at the time, we were responsible for going out and surveying about 40 coral reef ecosystems along the west coast of the Big Island of Hawaii. And we would go down with tourists, paying customers, and while they were on the boat, I would get to do surveys. I'd get to construct 3D models of coral reef ecosystems, do this periodically over time, and getting to observe, by doing that, we could observe the change over time. In 2018, there was a pretty bad bleaching event, which we know bleaching happens in Australia. And by doing this, we could collect lots and lots and lots of data, give it to people much smarter than myself, like Dom, to do something with that data, to synthesize that into reports, and then to give that data to the government, which was then used to inform the management of these coral reef ecosystems. And so that work, it made me feel really good about tourism again. And when I moved to Australia, I wanted to keep doing that. I wanted to keep doing things that made me feel good about the work I was doing. And so back in 2020, my wife and I decided to do the whole marriage, kids, settle down thing, and we ended up moving to Coffin Bay. And in Coffin Bay, there was no dive shop. It was a pretty, it's a pretty small community. About 600 people live there. And I kind of had no idea what I was getting myself into. Knew there's a bit of a summertime tourism boom, and thought, what the heck? Let's send it. Let's start a shop. And so I started Coffin Bay Scuba as a way to keep doing these activities, these citizen science programs, which at first, our first citizen science program was just documenting the marine life that we had in the area. I remember sitting on the beach, looking out into the bay. Has anybody been to Coffins before? I remember sitting there, hanging out, right on the beach and looking out to the water and thinking, what sort of marine life exists here? I remember going on to Google that night and typing in marine life in Coffin Bay, and the only thing I could find was the fish size limits, right, that you can catch and eat, as well as your daily bag limits. And there's maybe a dozen or so species on that list. And I thought to myself, man, this is a pretty big bay. Surely there's more than that. And so pretty much over the past 5 years, we've just been going down, taking photos of different critters, and we've built the largest marine life catalog, open source on iNaturalist to date for the region. So that's been pretty cool. And along the way, we're taking out tourists as well as local community members to participate in that. And then during that process of cataloging all the marine life that we had in the bay, I started to do some digging, literally started to excavate little pockets of the bay, just find all the little bivalves that were in the sand. And I ended up coming across buried oyster reef ecosystems. Started doing some Googling, found Dom's work, and like a crazy ex-girlfriend, I stalked him online and found his contact info and called him up, and now here we are. And so, like Dom had mentioned, from there we started up a collaborative project and to investigate the feasibility of restoring oyster reef ecosystems. And yeah, so here we are. You might have seen this photo a little bit earlier. This is some of the students that we certified how to dive to get involved with the project. When we were trying to do the research, when we were designing our experiment, we needed to put oyster shell in baskets and then deploy those all around Coffin Bay. Now, putting oyster shell in the water, keep in mind, like a Pacific oyster shell, it's a farmed waste product, and so there's biosecurity requirements around that. We didn't have those permits, and so what we were able to do was actually collect the dead Ngazi shells from the seafloor and put those into baskets. Now it was a lot of work, so it was sort of we needed a lot of free child labor to make this project happen. But they got their tickets, and some of these students have gone on to getting their coxswain's ticket and getting involved in the aquaculture industry around Port Lincoln and in Coffins. So it's been really awesome to see that. All the students we had go through that program were year 10 starting. And so we've been able to stick with them over the past few years and observe their progression, and hopefully give them a career path that sort of didn't necessarily exist. And so I think one of the really interesting outcomes from doing this project is creating potentially a new industry and new jobs that weren't necessarily in the region before, because as we know, much like Kangaroo Island, there's limited job opportunities in these regional areas. So over time, over a handful of years running Coffin Bay Scuba, ended up acquiring the dive shop up in Whyalla this past year. And now everything is sort of just under the Whyalla dive shop umbrella. And who here has been to Whyalla? Out of curiosity, anybody come to see the giant Australian cuttlefish? Anybody this year in particular? Last year? Cool, nice. Thanks for your patronage, appreciate it. So when we have, I think, when we talk about tourism, in a lot of places like KI, it's pretty seasonal, right? We have a good part of our year that we can make a good amount of our money that we can, live off of for the rest of the year until the next season comes. And so for me, I saw this as a really exciting opportunity because Coffin Bay is a summertime spot and Whyalla is a wintertime spot. So to complement, I guess, to keep me just going through the whole year, that was kind of the idea behind it. And so as oysters recruit during the summertime, we can run our experiments. The water needs to be above 18 degrees for the larvae to be released. And so we can't do too much reef building during the summer, but during the winter we can study cuttlefish. And so when we have a handful of trained divers, we can do some pretty cool stuff. So that was all my crew. This past winter, we did some really exciting research with Flinders University. Beth Jackal is doing her PhD on cuttlefish aggregation, migration dynamics, predation, as well as the impacts of tourism. So we're trying to understand better the impacts of divers, of glass-bottom boats, of kayaks around the Cuttlefish Coast. As you can see here, we've got some of our crew heading out. We were deploying underwater cameras that were pretty neat, that record for days and days and days on end. That camera, it's like a big tube with lots of batteries in it. And so we can still continue to use, our resources from the dive shop to collect lots of data even throughout the off season. And feel free to click on that. And so talking about seasonality, because seasonality, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But there are more risks associated with it. Things that are unprecedented, like the HAB, means that we have to be ready in the future. And can you click on the next thing? So talking about, really quick, oh, go back. Are you able to click on that guy? Nope, never mind. That was a little video. Go back. Oh, it's not happening. So just talking about the seasonality, the risks of running these sort of businesses. With the HAB, one of the things that we had this year, because we have a wintertime business, was everyone was asking about the bloom, and what tourists really valued is transparency and consistent communication. We found that most people would call and ask, but most people would not cancel. We had very few cancellations. Just looking at the dive industry as a whole, a lot of people come to South Australia to see, leafy sea dragons, then the cuttlefish, and maybe great whites. And so when they can't do one of those activities, like the leafies were, some of the leafy sea dragon sites were impacted. So when they couldn't see all three critters, they would cancel their trip. But that was very few. It was very few people who were having or who are wanting to cancel. So it's pretty promising that we could still persist even through the most detrimental and I guess from a news cycle media point of view, when all the news was coming out about the HAB, we were still able to do pretty all right throughout it. But part of that was setting up a media PR strategy plan to be proactive about communicating. This video right here was a sort of a supercut of dive site briefings that me and the crew did throughout the entire season. Making a way that was more efficient to communicate what the dive site was looking like, what the conditions were underwater. If you go to the Why Dive Instagram account, you can watch all those funny videos that we were putting out to help communicate that Whyalla as a site thankfully was not impacted and that we were keeping our eye on it. And crisis management. Crisis management being, we see all this stuff come out on the news about what's happening, and I think it's important for that information to be disseminated. But when we talk about tourism, it's this information, it does impact our industries. I'm fairly certain we got some tourism operators in the room that your numbers have been impacted by the media cycle. And it's really unfortunate right now that the South Australian tourism industry does not have that quite in place. But that doesn't mean that we can't have that in place for our own businesses and for our own communities. We have all the power. You have your own communications, distribution networks like your own Facebook and Instagram accounts that you can put information out on to help inform people. So we don't need to necessarily rely on big media conglomerates to do that for us. And thankfully, when we look at all of these, when we're trying to understand what is happening in South Australia around the bloom, thankfully we are not alone. And I mean this in the sense that climate change has impacted other areas in the past, has made other regions set up management strategies to be sustainable. So go ahead and click that. So this is the Great Barrier Reef, and the Great Barrier Reef, everyone's seen it, hopefully? Great Barrier Reef, it's an amazing ecosystem. It spans about 2,200 kilometers of the Queensland coastline, and people started diving there really actively in, sort of in the 80s was when the industry around there evolved and grew, and from then we started to see mass bleaching events happen more and more regularly, and how did the Queensland government deal with it? Well, they put together the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which it's a whole system. It's not just one group, it's a multitude of groups and committees comprised of tourism businesses, scientists, government agencies to help manage, this massive economic resource, not only economic resource, but, ecological marvel. It is one of the 7 wonders of the world. And so through the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, also known as the Reef Authority, they've set up a whole bunch of things. They've set up the Tourism Reef Protection Initiative, which is really interesting. I was actually there last week doing a exploratory liveaboard trip. And on this boat I was on, they had a marine ecologist she was just there on the tour vessel to do surveys, right? They were being opportunistic about going out to new sites that they'd never been to see what it was like and to document the coral health and the biodiversity. And she had a job on this boat through government funding, and that would have been through the Tourism Reef Protection Initiative. So there's funding streams for local operators to go out and collect data. The Tourism Management Action Strategy, which is a whole comprehensive, boring government plan. The Tourism Reef Advisory Committee, which is comprised of lots of tourism operators who actively reinvest their earnings into the group. They've developed things, short-term plans like the Reef Blueprint 2030 plan, just to have an idea of what's currently happening and what they expect the reef to be like in the short term, as well as the Reef 2050 plan, right? They're thinking long-term about what this looks like, how to, make this a sustainable thing, because, as we know, the GBR, it's extremely valuable from a tourism perspective. And between 2014 and 2030, over $5 billion has been and is going to be invested in the conservation, research, and restoration projects for the GBR. Now, we do not have this. So we need to understand, what do we have? What does South Australia have? What mechanisms do we have to try to get there? We got to keep in mind that South Australia, we're about like 30 years behind Queensland. So we got to start thinking about how do we get there? Well, what we have is we have local organizations, right? We have community groups, like a lot of the ones that are represented here today. We have regional organizations like TICSA, which is the Tourism Industry Council of South Australia. For any tourism operators who are not part of TICSA, I would recommend that you sign up to be a member. They offer a lot of industry supports. They offer workshops and great networking opportunities, which is awesome. We also have other regional organizations like RDA, and for you guys, you'd be a part of the RDA Adelaide, Fleurieu, and KI group. Is anybody here involved with RDA? Just out of curiosity. So RDA, anyone can sign up to, it's like they have elected positions, and they do a lot of not just tourism development, but just industry and community development, healthcare, child care. They look at a whole bunch of different things. And then we have our state tourism body, the SATC, the South Australian Tourism Commission, which puts out media and communications about South Australia as a whole. Now, understanding TICSA, or I guess understanding where each of these things fit. South Australia, the SATC, that's the big government body, and TICSA sort of acts as a middleman, so to speak, right? And TICSA while they're not necessarily state government, they're more of they represent the businesses that are in the state, and they can be really powerful. So this past year, with the development of the cuttlefish tourism industry, we've asked for a bit of organization because there's a handful of operators now. They're doing different things, and we want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so through TICSA, they've developed the Cuttlefish Coast Tourism Operators Advisory Group, terrible acronym. And because we have a industry group, we can leverage that to make change, okay? Now, anybody here hear about the bubble curtain? Right, so the bubble curtain, right, is this is a proactive measure that the South Australian government has gone ahead and done to help try to protect the cuttlefish eggs that have been laid this season against the harmful algal bloom. Basically what this is a big tube with perforations, and they pump air through it via a compressor on land, and it creates a big wall. It creates a physical barrier of air bubbles that can help separate cuttlefish and the algal bloom. It also helps sort of reoxygenate the water around it. So if the bloom reaches the cuttlefish coast, they can turn it on. So thankfully the bloom, it's not there yet. It hopefully won't be. But this was I believe it was about a $700,000 investment from the South Australian government to protect an asset, right? Unfortunately, I get into, I do this sort of stuff because I like being in the water. I like being a dive bum. But we have to, the government's not going to do things unless it's economically viable. When we look at the cuttlefish tourism industry, and it goes up every year. I think the last report they did was that it generated about $17 million for Waiala. That's 3 months, and that's not all going into my pocket. That's all the restaurants and accommodations. That's the town that's being supported by this, right? And so because we've organized and because we can now, I don't want to say pressure government, but we can lobby them a little bit, say, hey, we've got this really valuable asset, please help us protect it. And now they have, so kudos. But yeah, so I think it's one of these things when we talk about, this is just a small example for a small part of our South Australian coastline, but when we talk about what this could be a whole lot bigger, right? We could have bigger mechanisms in place to protect more of our coastline, to monitor more of our coastline, to do more research around our coastline. Yeah, so just talking about the South Australian diving industry, this is a problem that the diving industry has. So we've talked about the cuttlefish industry now. The diving industry, it's mostly the cage diving. We have cuttlefish, of course, and we also have the leafy sea dragons, and we have the dive shops in Adelaide and a couple small operators down Florio way to support that. Now, when we look at this in a regional perspective, it's really disjointed. It's really far apart. We know South Australia; it's a big place. And essentially each of these little pockets of industry are 3 to 4 hours drive away from each other. And the dive industry, when we look at the dive industry in Great Barrier Reef, it's all in one place. It's highly condensed, and they were able to get the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority up and running in a relatively timely manner. Whereas here, our issue is that it's not that we don't talk to each other. There's lots of the operators I have very friendly and amicable relationships with. I've actually worked for pretty much most of the people in my old days. But we are not as organized as we should be. And so this is one of the things that we are looking at as the dive industry, is to get more organized so that we can go to government and say, hey, look, we've got this big industry that I think cage diving generates 20 million, cuttlefish generates 17 million, and then leafy sea dragons, I think that's close to about 10 million as well. Don't quote me on that, but those numbers would be so much greater if they were together and if we were working together. So we are starting to. This year we've engaged with Divers for Climate, which is a diving industry advocacy group, and they deal a lot with climate change. And they started up in the Great Barrier Reef, but with the HAB and everything that's going on, they've come down here and they've been helping us get our act together, which has been really nice. Yeah, so that essentially covers it for me. Does anybody have